I hate to inform you, Dan, but there's been a season change, unfortunately, as of today. I feel like you've just been kind of, like for the last 24 hours, you've just been on various forms of transportation. Not sure if you've noticed. I'm wearing a sweater, I'm wearing pants, I'm wearing socks after a kind of hellishly hot weekend. So I'm not saying that summer's over. I'm not saying that fall is here. But I'm saying that, just begin preparing yourself is all I'm saying.
Okay. Well, I was expecting to get back. I've just gotten home, everybody, and I was expecting it would be really miserable and rainy, and actually it's really sunny and nice.
Oh, well, what do I know?
But I have seen lots of fallen leaves, so,
Okay.
I guess that means something.
Chestnuts are forming. And now I'm shrugging. Like, that means something. So, what are you going to do?
Oh, yeah, sweet chestnuts.
Yeah.
Commiserations, Jack. Seasons.
Time. Before you know it, the beans will be back in. It was only a few episodes when I took the beans out. Okay, we're back to it. It's been a while, if you can't tell. We haven't done a show in what? Like a month? Something like that? I don't know. Yeah. It's been a while. We warned you this was going to happen. I went back home for a little while. I'm back now. Did I tell you? I must have told you how my first 6 days went.
I'll pretend. Right? I'll pretend that I didn't hear.
Okay, I appreciate.
Oh no, yeah. Go on. It doesn't matter.
Well, we got there and it was 103, which in your talk is 41, 42. So it was hot. Yeah. And then it was 102 the next day. Before all of that, my mom got COVID. So for the first 3 days, she had COVID. Fourth day was fine. Fifth day, my partner got a viral chest infection and we had to go to the American healthcare system for them to just be like, oh yeah, you're fine. That was a bill for $450 because we don't have insurance. And then the day after that, a tropical storm hit. This hasn't happened in my life. It hasn't happened for a century in California where I live. And then during that tropical storm, when we were just inside waiting for the rain to stop, a magnitude 5 earthquake hit. So that was the beginning of my trip. I was just okay, good,
eventful,
excellent.
Eventful. I thought you were going to tell me about all your difficulties getting through customs and flying and yeah. Anyway.
I don't even want to think about flying. I've done my big flight for the year. I don't have to do it again.
Never again.
Never
again.
I'll have to fly
but then everything
Ireland
calmed down
point.
after that, and you had a nice holiday.
And it was excellent. It was lovely. The outdoors. I think I've decided that don't really know. Home, what does that concept mean? Probably the backcountry where I'm from. It's very nice. I went up there. A bunch of the roads are still closed because all the roads got washed out during all the rain earlier this year. But where I was able to go, just so beautiful, and I love it, and it's so great. Climbed Mount Baldy, which I'd never done. Excellent, lovely time.
That's a really nice realization.
Yeah, it is. It is really nice. I think I've probably always known that, but that's good. I don't know. Nice. What are you going to do? Nice. And you, I believe, organized some sort of music festival, Dan?
Yes, I participated in.
The organization of.
Very pleased that I didn't have to do anything organizational. This was my working holiday where I didn't actually have to organize anything or be in charge of anything or organize people or think about it or worry about anything in particular. So it was nice. Yeah. One of my homes, dancing in the woods. yeah, did lots of that.
Worst homes to have.
It was good fun. Yeah, it was nice. So yeah, I've had a nice little break as well. Yeah, we both had a nice break.
Nice break. And I feel like we probably should have used that break to read something longer. We read a 15-page lecture this week. What are you going to do? I've also just noticed, Dan, that this feels like you're missing the picture that's always behind you, the painting, or the drawing, which is it feels like there's an episode of The Simpsons or something where the sailboat behind the couch is gone. It feels off. Something's weird about this. I don't know.
Yeah. People have been in my room moving things around.
You knew this was going to happen.
I'm going to show Jack there's a big barricade in my room now.
Oh wow! Wow!
You know.
It's
fine.
Dear.
Yeah, the picture is missing. We talked about it very vaguely a few weeks ago. Nobody's ever going to know or see what it is.
The famous picture.
Yeah, it's fine. There's now an empty space on my wall.
You'll have to get a new
will
picture.
I fill it with?
Whoa! Leave your suggestions below. Next week you'll have a picture of Lennon.
Yeah. Sorry if it's sorry if it's disconcerting.
It is a little weird, I'll say that, but I'll allow it.
Yeah.
What are you gonna do?
I think my favorite one, favorite piece of background was when we talked to Cliff Connolly and he just had a framed copy of the Weekly Worker behind him whilst he was talking.
Wow, I completely forgot about that. That's right. Mm-hmm. That's awesome.
Mm-hmm. So maybe I'll do that.
Well,
if I had a copy of the Weekly Worker to frame,
you were thinking about that. Yeah. You were. I saw you this past weekend, and you were like, maybe I should subscribe to the Weekly Worker. And I was like, Dan, I asked, how are you? That's what I should do.
It's the kind of things I think about.
Yeah, that would solve all of my problems.
Yes.
Well, well, Dan, a while ago, someone on Twitter asked someone else on Twitter what our show was like, right? We had nothing to do with this interaction, and I only saw it after the fact, and somebody explained it as if Wallerstein was an ultra, which I thought was excellent. That made me feel so good. I was like, I don't know anything about Wallerstein. I'm happy to be called an ultra. I think that's funny. Oh, speaking of ultras, actually, before I get to why I told that, I did read The Coming Insurrection for some reason when I was home. That's what I decided to pick up and read. My partner was reading these like nice vacation books, and I was just like, having to like hide the cover of the book wherever I went, which was very funny. Incredibly funny book. Mm-hmm. I don't know what else is there to say on it. Just funny stuff.
It's been a very long time since I've read it, and I mean, I've always felt the lure of the communizer, sure. The communizer within, the calling of the communizer. Yeah, yeah, it's good fun. Yeah.
It's good fun. I'll say that it's good fun. Anyway, if Wallerstein was an ultra, so this time we're actually reading Wallerstein. I don't remember when we did an episode on Wallerstein a while ago.
Yeah,
about
we
world
didn't
systems
actually
theory,
read. We didn't read Immanuel Wallerstein for that. I don't think we read an article on his theories.
Yeah, and academics have a way of always telling the truth about people's theories. So if you want to know what somebody actually said, just read what somebody else said about them. Yeah, somebody that you don't know anything about them, and I'm sure it'll be fine. So how much fake information could there have been in that?
We should just read Robert Brenner's opinion of Immanuel Wallerstein. Yeah. I'm sure, there you go.
Does Lenin have an opinion on Wallerstein? Can we somehow make some sort of time riff happen to make that? No, but I bring this up because, Dan, we're actually reading Wallerstein this week. This is an essay I found a while ago. It's called The Bourgeoisie as Concept and Reality. I think it was a lecture that he gave at some point. I could have looked that up. I don't know, at some point during his lifetime. That was later turned into an essay. Really easy to read because it's kind of written like, to be spoken or whatever. I dug it. I actually thought it was really, really cool. I didn't know quite what to expect. This was kind of chosen in a like haze of like, I'm getting on a plane for like 12 hours tomorrow. I don't know. What should we do? And you're like, I don't know. I'm getting on like a coach for 12 hours. Tomorrow? What should we do? And I was just like, I don't know. I had this sitting in the background somewhere. So I was a little worried that it was just, it was going to just be kind of boring. I thought this rocked. I thought there was a lot of really good stuff in here. Some kind of weird stuff that we can talk about later. But now I get it. I understand why people suggest Wallerstein, because he's someone that like understands Marx and who's clearly very influenced by him. But it's interesting because he wouldn't necessarily call himself a Marxist, right? And definitely speaks about Marxists as like these other people. So it's good to kind of get a critique, or at least an outside view from someone who isn't an idiot, or like a liberal or conservative or something like that, right? So ostensibly, this is all about what it means to be a bourgeois, what it means to be the bourgeoisie, and pretty neat. I'll say that. What'd you think?
Yeah, there are some really compelling theories. I almost said takes in this essay. Yeah, I agree. It was very easy to read and digest. I found it challenging, not challenging to understand, but just challenging of some of my preconceived ideas. And so I'm coming into this not knowing how I feel about some aspects of the conclusion, I suppose. But yeah, you're correct to say that he's a writer who clearly understands these theories very well, but isn't doctrinaire in his approach. You're probably correct to say that he doesn't call himself a Marxist. But it's clear from this text, at least, it's clear the sort of background context, the material upon which this text is based is very much inspired by an understanding of capitalism that we would generally agree with, an understanding of class society and its sort of reality and existence, and how essential it is to do class analysis to understand contemporary society. But he's trying to update, develop new ideas, speak in a modern context, considering history as something which is evolving and expanding and ever changing and dynamic, in ways that we, I think, in the past have really dug when we've found it in other writers and sought to champion when we talk about sort of generally what our approach is, if we have one.
Yes, the auxiliary statements approach. Yes, which changes each 2 weeks for some reason. I don't know why. Absolutely, I think that's the main thing I took from this that I really appreciated was his understanding of history is dynamic, and he's certainly not willing to just be like the bourgeoisie. Sure, that's exactly the same thing that it was in the 1600s as it is right now. He's not content to do that. He recognizes that there are differences, and if we're really going to understand this concept of bourgeoisie and kind of lay it up against class society and kind of counterpose it to the proletariat, right, to really understand where we're going, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right, like, which he wants to do. He's like, well, we really need to understand what it actually means to be bourgeoisie, because like, now it's kind of difficult to just say, well, they own the means of production, because there are so many like weird little stratums of intermediary classes. And I'm not going to go full sicko and be like, well, like, do those, does it all even mean anything anymore? Like, this isn't a postmodern take. Like, he still very much understands that there is a necessity to understand what it is to be bourgeoisie, because he's like, it still exists. Like, owners of the means of production, he's kind of taking Marx's guidelines of like, make money off of their investments via their property and owning private property and, owning means of production, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, versus like the proletariat who has nothing to sell but their labor, and then expanding upon that. He's like, if you had a liberal be like, well, what does a bourgeoisie even mean? And they're trying to like criticize Marx's work and they'd never actually read him, they'd be like, surplus value? Like, is that like, that's like money, right? Like, what does that actually mean? But he definitely understands what he's talking about. And I would agree, comes to some kind of weird conclusions, but maybe, I don't know, maybe they're good conclusions. I'm definitely not going to come down and be like, Immanuel Wallerstein, the man's a fool for his conclusions. The last section, I was a little bit like, well, I didn't see this coming. I don't know if I fully agree with this at all.
Yeah.
It was kind of out of left field. Yeah, we'll get to that. Kind of was very Weberian. I'm just going to pretend like I know what that means.
Yeah.
But should we get into, I guess, why he thinks that this is an important word, I guess, bourgeoisie, and understudied, perhaps?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like one of the things he's doing very well is like, just bouncing off what you were just saying for a minute. Like, there's a tendency to take a kind of like sociological approach to class, and in that you see all these different kind of stratas in society, but it's kind of like once almost one whole, which doesn't recognize that sort of fundamental, maybe Marxist class cleavage kind of thing. And he's taking elements of that and sort of still synthesizing it with, there is a truth to the sort of fundamental class distinction that we get in Marxism. So basically, he's sort of like merging in some ways both of those conceptions of class. And he's also taking a definition of class which seems both to be interested in the pure economic functioning of a class relation, but then also all of the sort of like ancillary cultural elements that go into that, which are sort of like fundamental to historical development as well, I suppose.
Yeah, the cultural stuff was not something we've approached before, and I was a little bit uncomfortable with. I don't know if you were too.
Yeah. And I think maybe this is our first opportunity we might be able to talk about something like the professional managerial class is something which is banded around a lot, isn't it, in sort of like left discussions, and something that we haven't ever read or talked very much about. I mean, that phraseology isn't used in this at all, but I definitely, this is touching on those kind of discussions, and maybe it's our first tentative foray into that. But yeah, he does. He thinks this is a really important, like, historical piece of terminology. And he kind of starts the essay with a sort of like very classical description of who the bourgeoisie are, what the sort of like classical narrative of what their role in history has been, sort of explaining where they come from. And sort of folded into that is a discussion of the origins of capitalism and its sort of emerging out of feudal society. And one of the things he sort of seems to make quite constant reference to is that in various different ways, particularly in the 19th century, like liberals and conservatives and the sort of socialists and Marxists all seem to incorporate some idea of there having been this class which emerged out of the sort of like gaps and contradictions in feudal society and was the thing which compelled the transformation toward capitalism and then provided sort of the dynamic drive to the early development of capitalism, I suppose, and sort of dictated what its trends and core tenets were, I guess.
Yeah, the what does he call him? The like protagonist of the modern world, right? And he does say that those three, he calls them like the three great brands of. He doesn't say sociology, but I guess of just thought, right? Conservatism, meaning like, hey, monarchism, we should go back to that. That was the only stable thing. Liberalism, basically like, the bourgeoisie and representative democracy or parliamentarism, I guess, at the very least. And then Marxists, right? Everybody is like, yeah, there's a thing called the bourgeoisie and it's really important. Conservatives are kind of like, nouveau riche, goddamn bourgeoisie, whereas liberals are like, this is us, this is good, and Marxists are obviously like, they play their role, but, what
the conservatives are like, they're bad, the liberals are like, they're good, and the conservatives are, the Marxists are like, they're good and bad.
Yeah, sometimes they need to be helped. They were good at one point. Yeah, It's interesting. He says that they all describe them in very similar ways, these three veins of thinking. And he says they're all described by these three, conservatives, liberals, and Marxists. And they're described as having like occupational qualities. And by that, it's, at first he says burghers and the bourgeoisie were kind of like merchants, and then later on it kind of evolved into employers of wage labor, which is a side note. I think I'm constantly looking out for, like, whenever we read anything about the origin of capitalism, for like the earliest date that somebody says. And in this he's like, and they might have existed as early as the 11th century. I was like, let's go. The origin of capitalism, 1000 AD. History is indeed dynamic. But other than occupational qualities, they also have like economic qualities as well, which is obviously like purely driven by the need of accumulation. And then he also says there are cultural qualities to the bourgeoisie, which is the thing that I was a little bit like, I haven't come across this, and I'm slightly like, is this true, or is this kind of just like very Eurocentric kind of silliness, where he says that they're not reckless at all. They're very self-interested. They're very dour. They're very rational. I think this is kind of just coming from like Protestant work ethic stuff. You know what I mean? About like capitalism could only have happened because of the Protestant work ethic, which like, yeah, okay, dude. But I mean, you see what he's saying, right? Because it's like there are certain cultural aspects to the bourgeoisie which, whether they're ideological or whatever, like they're necessary, because you're not going to be able to just you're not going to be able to be acted upon by capital in such a way to become a successful capitalist if you aren't self-interested and if you are very reckless, right? I mean, like, I'm sure we can all think of like a reckless billionaire or whatever, but I think that he would maybe say that they're actually closer to the aristocracy than to the actual bourgeoisie. And so he kind of ties all of this up by just basically saying that the bourgeoisie early on, whenever you want to pin it, that it was, beginning to be formed, is defined not only by capital, but also by consumption. And their consumption habits are mild. They'll be a little bit flashy now and then, but whereas the aristocracy of, Europe was like, think like Barry Lyndon, think like just debauched, like, fucking like mountains of gold and like, servants on every corner. The bourgeoisie was very like, Protestant work ethic and like kind of like, okay, well, I have a nice carriage, but other than that, everything needs to get reinvested back into the production process so I can make more money.
This isn't the kind of like view that he says he believes. I don't think this is kind of like a kind of I'm gonna say Weberian when I don't really understand it either, but like a sort of like an argument which is sort of saying it is, well, the sort of classical understanding is, under feudalism, you have the lords and you have the peasants, and then you have a small, like, free citizenry, mostly localized in the towns, who are not aristocrats. They don't have any of that sort of weight of history, the sort of family lineage. They don't own property in the same way, but also they're not um, serfs. They're not somehow bonded to a piece of land. They're not in any ways connected or obligated to serve a lord, and so they exist in this sort of like non-space within feudal society. I mean, it's a very sort of simplistic understanding of history as a teleological progression whereby the next stage emerges from the gaps in the previous one, when which in some ways is also very similar to the idea that capitalism, or whatever the next stage of history is somehow hiding, lingering within its like parent mode of production. And these are all things which he's critiquing or sort of seeking to move beyond. But it's very much an idea that it's almost the characteristics of this class, maybe their sort of thriftiness or their I don't know, proclivity or desire to trade in a different way, or engage in different kind of economic relations, that almost creates capitalism, right? It's because of this class of person, and the way they behave, that brings this mode of production into existence, which is, I mean, in some ways there's probably a sort of a materialist version of that argument, but then you could have a very kind of like non-materialist one as well, I suppose.
He's getting close to like a really dialectical, I think, understanding of the transition, because he is, like I said earlier, he's totally happy to just be like, oh yeah, there were burghers like as early as 1000 AD in certain parts of Europe, and if you believe that they're proto-capitalist, then like, yeah, this took a really long time for capitalism to come about. And so you do kind of get this little bit of an understanding, which I always really appreciate, a kind of like, where you're able to see, and I don't mean this in a teleological way, but like you are able to see seeds of the next mode of production, and kind of like even maybe like pockets of one type of a mode of production as existing under a different one. And, we haven't read the Absolutist State book yet. We'll get to that one eventually, but I would imagine there's kind of an argument in there somewhere where it's like, well, things could have gone a different way. Maybe they couldn't have, or maybe that's Ellen Mixon's Wood. She's the one that says that maybe things could have gone a different way. But he's basically just pointing out that history, it takes a while, and I don't know. He is trying to do a dialectical thing here, I think. I kind of have begun to think of him as like the Wario to Bookchin's Luigi, and a like kind of like dialectical understanding of things. He's much more like kind of on it, right? And much more academic, but yeah.
But he does have a really interesting critique. He makes a really interesting point anyway, one that I was very excited by, where he says, so much is written about the development of the working class, both inside of capitalist society, but also in the transition. And he says, like, he makes reference to E.P. Thompson's book, the Origins of the English Working Class. And he says, but nobody's ever written that book, The Origins of the Bourgeoisie, The Origins of the Ruling Class. And likewise, nobody has talked about the development of the bourgeoisie. Well, this is what he's saying. I don't know whether this is true, but he's claiming that nobody's really talked about the development of the bourgeoisie under capitalism. And rather, he critiques historians for saying that the proletariat has a sort of like an origin, and continues to develop through history. But for some reason, there's this idea that the bourgeoisie almost sort of sprung into existence and has characteristics which are transhistorical, at least in the history of capitalism. They have their nature hasn't developed and changed at all. And what he does go on to do is sort of explain how he thinks that the nature of the bourgeoisie has developed over those sort of 200 years, 250 years since the sort of the real or their real emergence into history, I guess.
Mm. Yeah, what does he say? He's like, we're just supposed to expect or to believe that the bourgeoisie sprung like fully formed, like Athena from the head of Zeus. I liked that. I was like, oh yeah, I guess you're right. Like, I don't know. Sometimes when you think about history, it's easy to imagine, like, even when you're reading like the Ellen Meakson's Woodbook or Brennerist stuff, when they're talking about these proto-capitalists, either in the English countryside or in towns or whatever, it's easy to just in your mind's eye be like, imagine an industrialist in like 19th century Britain, you know what I mean? And be like, oh yeah, they were always the same. The bourgeoisie was just always the same class and they were always the same, people. So then from here, he goes into talking about kind of the point of the whole essay, I suppose, which is to talk about how he believes that maybe there is a tendency towards, I don't know. It's hard to say exactly what the tendency is. He begins by bringing up this idea of the aristocratization of the bourgeoisie, right? Which is a really cool, I think, idea. Well, cool. It's an interesting idea, right? Which is basically that the bourgeoisie, in certain circumstances and certain types of capitalists, tend to want to act more like the aristocracy than how they should. Right. And their world historical mission to build up to socialize production and to build up the means of production so that we can fucking get socialism. Right. That's their mission. And oftentimes he's like, well, OK, but if you believe that teleological Marxist thought, if you actually try and study history, you're going to come up against a wall because oftentimes the bourgeoisie does not act in its class self-interest. Sometimes individual capitalists act in their own self-interest, and that means becoming more like an aristocrat. And what he means by more of an aristocrat kind of has several meanings, but to compare it to, he says that's aristocratization, fucking Christ, of the bourgeoisie is a phrase that you often get in histories talking about the 16th and through 18th centuries. Capitalists then, right? Or at least bourgeoisie then. When you get to the 20th century, people stop using that phrase and they start saying betrayal of their historical role, right? So it's kind of a way to say, certain capitalists have gone on to not fully reinvest their profits into production like they should, like all good capitalist Protestants should, and instead they fritter it away on, luxuries, or they find a rent to sit on, just a fat fucking rent, and they just kick their feet up and they go, they're not productive anymore. And the kind of first example he gives of this is from a book, was it called Buddenbrooks or something? Thomas Mann, an old book, where he's like, the typical path of one of these old money families is you have this like pull yourself up by your bootstraps, think of the typical American dream bullshit story about like, somebody that came over from Italy and then they started like, okay, I'm going to be a bit stereotypical here, started a pizza shop in Brooklyn. And then that went on to become the biggest pizza shop ever. And then their son was the CEO. And then their kids were kind of like layabouts. And then his great grandkids just kind of sat around and did nothing and just fritter away their wealth on like planes and fucking like, I don't know, swimming pools or some bullshit. That's kind of what he means by the aristocratization of the bourgeoisie. And it's something worth noting because it's like, yeah, if we want to talk about, getting to socialism, a solid understanding of class and how classes act and what their self-interests actually are is important to understand. And if the bourgeoisie is so important in getting socialism, why isn't it doing the thing, Dan? Why isn't it doing the thing? To be clear, I wouldn't do the thing either. I'd just kind of chill.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. In some ways, I was thinking, it wasn't entirely clear to me what mechanism he was saying was happening here. Well, basically, what I was expecting him to come onto was some kind of discussion of formal and real subsumption. It sort of feels like there's a kind of formal and real thing going on the part of the bourgeoisie where they start to mimic in some ways the characteristics of the aristocracy. I don't know whether there's any point to that or not, but like it's definitely the case that like they sort of like got manor houses and they became very conspicuous in their consumption and didn't sort of hold to this pure bourgeois ethos of reinvestment, as you say, I guess.
It seems like there have been bourgeoisie since the beginning who have done this, though. You know what I mean? Like, obviously, percentage-wise, it's not like everybody was doing it back then. Otherwise, we wouldn't have gotten like the modern world. There was obviously more and more. He says that the percentage of the population that is bourgeois has gone up relatively and obviously absolutely since early days. But yeah, I don't know. It seems like it's been going on for a long time at least.
Yeah, I'd say what it was that actually made me think of formal and real consumption. There's a section in this when he talks about the sort of like 19th century Victorian factory owner who has a kind of like paternalistic relationship to the people who work in his factory and builds his kind of community so that all of his workers live nearby, kind of thing. And there's a kind of mimicking of the lord and the serf arrangement in a very kind of real geographical sense. And it was that made me think about formal consumption in
really
the sense of like, is the capitalist here mimicking the structure of the feudal class relationship to kind of replace it in some way in its new, clearly with a new economic functioning, but in a sort of form which is familiar in some ways. And I was expecting him to say that and he didn't. He almost turned that into an example of this aristocratization happening. That was my reading anyway. I thought he was using that example as an example of that process when really it seemed like it was something else to my reading anyway.
Yeah, it's almost like this needed. I'm sure he's written. I would hope he's written about this more because it does seem like it needs to be expanded on a bit. It almost seems like up until when he starts talking about the modern times and the modern bourgeoisie, it's almost you kind of get a sense of like it's just a couple of bad eggs doing the aristocratization thing and a couple of bad families. And like he's basically saying that old money breeds this kind of, delinquent behavior of not doing what you should, which is accumulation at all costs. What are you doing? Sitting by the infinity pool? Give me a fucking break. You can't be doing that. You got to be out there investing, Dan. I mean, it's like a really bad motivational speech.
Yeah. It's the classic complaint against any third or fourth generation. Like, I don't know. People, for some reason, I can only think of like the Kennedys, or something like that. But of course, their wealth all came from noble.
Yeah, and bootlegging, which is all, that's accumulation, Dan. That's what we're talking about. Kennedy's dad was an accumulator.
He does have some really scathing things to say about the notion of the failure of the bourgeoisie to fulfill its historical role. Kind of thing.
Fools.
Particularly, he's particularly scathing of sort of Marxist-Leninists and the what underpinned a certain Marxist strategy during the sort of the Third International post the 1917 revolution of like, even before actually, of like, we will aid the bourgeoisie to power and then they'll do the work of sort of like initiating the revolution and our work is to be done later on, kind of thing. So there's this sort of like scapegoat for socialist and Marxist parties that are like, now isn't our time, later in history will sort of like rise to the fore, kind of thing. And he makes this sort of like joking point that the vast majority of bourgeoisie sort of fail to fulfill their historical role, kind of thing. Like there aren't very many that followed the British example. And so, yeah, maybe what you're taking to be the preordained historical role of the bourgeoisie is actually not it at all, and their failure is actually what he comes back on is maybe their failure is actually the historical trend that we should be looking at and imagining to be their class imperative, I suppose.
Yeah, that definitely takes form, he says, especially in kind of like developing countries where there, like where we would go on to see developmental regimes or even like where there were failed socialist revolutions. He talks a lot about, he just says Africa. I would imagine he means like sub-Saharan Africa, where there'll be a bourgeois revolution, quote unquote. And then this just kind of leads to a new class of like, what does he call them? Like the administrative bourgeoisie. That's where you want to be, where they just kind of like sit on a weird form of like clout rent and just kind of hang out. And they have economic power and they obviously have a political power, but they're not really like developing things as they should.
Mm-hmm.
And then everybody throws up their hands in the socialist side and is like, why do we support these people?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? It's just like, I thought we were supposed to get socialism right after this. At a certain point, it is like, how much more does the bourgeoisie need to do? You know what I mean? It's like, especially now. I don't know when this was written, but it's like, I don't know how much more they got to do.
One of the first footnotes is like,
okay, yeah, that sounds about right. Speaking of footnotes, did you see who got a mention in here?
No, tell me.
Ralph Miliband.
Oh, yeah. Well, I wasn't quite about to come on to that, but what I was going to say was like what he's doing in the middle sections of this essay is sort of poking holes in the narrative that he puts forward in the first half, right? Of the first section, right? The first section, he gives the classical definition of what the bourgeois class is and the historical role they're supposed to have fulfilled. And then he says, well, no, actually, there's this aristocratization process that happens, and there's this sort of the historical failure. And then the third point that he comes on to, which is probably really pertinent to the argument he goes on to make, is the idea that there has been in the history of the 20th century, I suppose, this break between being the owner of a capital, a piece like a factory or what have you, and being the person that's directly in control of the everyday running of that that plant kind of thing. There's been a transition to being a stockholder or holding shares, and the creation of a class of person who does the everyday control of the productive process itself. And that here he's talking about the sort of like development of the manager, I suppose. And he also talks about this sort of historical process that he says has happened, which has previously been called a process of embourgeoisement, where like proletarians become more bourgeois in their class character. Now, this is when we get into this murky territory of like cultural versus economic class position, I suppose. But he is doing an interesting work of like very succinctly describing some of the developments in class relations that have led us to the point now in the 21st century where it's a lot more murky, and we potentially have new classes to discuss. The classical Marxist claim that capitalism is simplifying the class relation and making it more bare and more obvious. He is heavily problematizing that claim, I suppose.
Yeah, but also like I totally agree, and I do think that more work needs to be done, because like, you know, ownership of means of production on one hand and owning nothing but your own labor, that's like, yeah, obviously that's true. Those are the class dividing lines in society. That, I hate to say it though, but if you actually want to do politics now, that's where you begin, because there's a lot more other stuff built on top of that. And you're right. When he started going into this new middle class stuff, I was a little bit like, what's he talking about? Where's this going? But it's funny because he does come out and say these managers or whatever, these directors, the people who have control, not ownership, but control over these enterprises, who are making like a lot of the actual day-to-day decisions about the enterprises themselves, which, you know, it's incredibly funny thinking about the aristocratic bourgeoisie at the top, just sitting there drinking Mai Tais by the pool, doing nothing. But like, I don't know. It's interesting, and he does recognize that even though he's like this close to being like, it's a new class, it's, you know, it's I want to say it's a new class, this new middle class. He does recognize that they still are closer to proletarians, in that they are still living off of the wage. They're living off of selling their labor. And when he said that, I was like, oh, phew, thank God. But at the end of the day, like, that is still a pretty big difference, and it's obviously not enough for me to want to be like it's own class, because I do still think that you need to solely define class based on this like base, right? And then you can kind of go into like little micro classes or whatever. But yeah, it's also important to not just be like a jerk and just be like, well, actually in the Communist Manifesto it says that there's a teleological thing happening with class. I think that people take the line in the Communist Manifesto about, you know, more and more we're splitting up into two hostile camps way too literally. And I think that it's the one thing people have read of Marx, and so they go, no, that's what Marx thought. But it's like, that was a political document. It wasn't like this document that Marx spent his life, you know, writing to be like, this is the truth. Like, obviously he put a lot of work into it, him and Engels, but it's like, that was written for a popular audience. And it's like in Capital, he talks about how there's potentially a new strata of the working class evolving. There's the section, it's either in the, it's the whole section where he's talking about time wages versus piece wages. He goes into saying like, hey, and actually there's kind of a new strata of the working class that is formed that basically, kind of make their living by whipping other members of the working class into shape, right? They're like factory supervisors. And it's like, okay, yeah. It's like, of course, you don't have to like clutch your pearls every time somebody is like a new class in my Marxism. It's like, we don't necessarily have to call it a class because I think that your relationship to the means of production is the most important thing. But yeah, it also fucking cracked me up when he was like, but also hedonistically, they're a little bit aristocratic. I was like, wow, you're right. Because like all of my supervisors and managers all have fucking beer guts and are just like sickos. So, what are you going to do? I have often thought about this, especially when I worked in retail, the division of, how when you work somewhere and sometimes they're like your boss, especially when they're trying to get you to work for free at the beginning or end of a shift, they're like, we're a family. We're all just a big family here. I think the dividing line can be easily found by who actually has to believe that bullshit and who is just like, fuck off, give me a break. I'm not working here for free. Because it's like, I remember when I worked in retail, the managers of the store of like a big chain were like, they would constantly go past their salary hours. And, I remember one of them used to like sleep on the shop floor because there was so much shit to do before the next day during like busy seasons. And like, prole isn't going to do that. Like just your typical prole isn't going to do that because they're like, fuck it. But they're getting bribed enough with like, I don't know, shares or a better salary or better benefits that, they're okay with it. And so there is a bit of a dividing line. Again, it's important if you're trying to do politics, but if you're solely doing sociology, you can be like, well, but is it its own class? I don't know. It depends on what you mean by class.
Yeah, I didn't mean to argue for... Oh, maybe I did, but anyway, I didn't intend to argue for a sort of simplified understanding of Marxist class analysis. I think maybe he is here, though. And I think although you're definitely right to say that what he says in this section, at least in the middle, is that, but these people are still wage workers. But I think later on in this, he sort of starts to talk about this class of person almost analogously with the bourgeoisie. And I think there is a vagueness for him. And maybe that's fair, right? I don't know. But
well, I think when we're talking about when we live in a world where politics is defined in the bourgeois way of like, let's just say a parliamentary democracy, right? Then these little microclasses do really become important because people's ideologies will change and they won't act in their class interest, heavy air quotes, right? And I think this is why he's trying to frame it as a bourgeoisification of a certain strata of the proles and an aristocratization of a certain sector of the bourgeoisie, right? Because he's like, well, this is how you get some sicko proles going against their interest, and how you get some sicko bourgeoisie going against their class interest, but like going for it in their own personal interest, Yeah. What did you make of the psychologic stuff of Capital? Where he's like the logic and then the psychologic.
I didn't take very much away from it at all, if I'm totally honest. I mean, it is. I guess it is vitally important to at least make an effort to bear in mind that there is a human psychology that's underlying particular behaviors, I suppose.
Yeah.
Why don't you tell me what you thought if you hadn't?
I don't know. Not too much. You can tell he kind of criticizes Weber at the beginning of this, and then he brings up Weber here and is kind of like, but was he right or was he wrong? Who's to say? He does a lot of like, I don't know. I'm just a little guy. How should I? Like he'll bring up a really controversial topic and then be like, oh, but I don't know. I think the purpose whatever. What I took away from it was when you are trying to do an analysis similar to Marx's, much like when you're talking about labor, you need to have your kind of goggles on to talk about the big picture, abstract social labor, and to talk about the little picture, concrete labor, the little guy just sweeping the floor or whatever, right? And I think it's a similar thing when it comes to class analysis, because the bourgeoisie's interest as a class is its world historical mission. You could say, in the emergent totality of the class, yeah, accumulation is what the class's interest is. It isn't having a fail son who's going to spend it all on like Candy Crush or something like that, right? Like, but when you talk about individual specific capitalists, yeah, you're going to see some aristocratization. Now, where it gets a little murky for me is that I don't know if he's actually saying that this is a tendency that's growing. When he starts talking about rents, I think it's pretty clear that it is growing, because it gets a little weird at the end where he's like, oh, so if you have a rent, then you're an aristocrat, and also monopolies rent, so all the bourgeoisie are aristocrats. It's like, wait, that feels a little bit like, I see what he's saying, but it feels a little bit like twisting definitions there. But this, yeah, I don't know. The psychology stuff is important in that it's like, Marx said this. Marx was like, when you're doing the class struggle, you'll probably have to come across and make alliances with some segments of the bourgeoisie. This is just how it happens. Individual people will have different interests than their class. We see it with proles. We see it with the bourgeoisie. In some aspect, I'm sure you saw it with aristocrats, right? So, I don't know. It's nuance, I guess.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think we should maybe come on to the rent stuff a little bit, because I think it does become the fundamental element of his argument, I suppose. I think, as I understand it, the sort of like thrust of the argument he's making is that like the most important thing for capitalism and for capitalists is the process of accumulation, and I think he seems to imply that at the end of the day, having a rent and being a rentier, is actually the most efficient way to accumulate. It's the best way to improve your rate of profit, is the sort of general phraseology that he uses. And
I think it's the best way to squeeze a disproportionate amount of surplus value out of a given commodity chain is to find a rent to sit on.
Yeah. And by extension of that, to monopolize the control of a commodity chain as well.
Yeah, and that part made me a little bit like, because he comes out and he's like, okay, all bourgeoisie want a rent. They seek a rent in that they're, if nothing else, seeking a monopoly, and a monopoly's rent, right? Which is true, like, I guess, or like if you're selling something above its value, then anything above its actual value in terms of how it gets translated into price, I guess you would call that a rent, right? And so if you have a monopoly, then yeah, you're extracting a rent out of the market. Still, though, the jump to being like, that's aristocratic behavior, I think is kind of funny. And it's like, okay. It's like, I guess. It seems like,
but I think it's not aristocratic behavior in the sense that it's backward looking. I think maybe the argument he's making is it's aristocratic behavior in the sense that it's not classically bourgeois behavior. It's more complicated than a simple overcoming of one particular set of class behaviors with another set of class behaviors that belong to a completely independent and separate class. So maybe what he's doing is sort of just complicating the teleological nature of some other people's arguments, rather than saying that we haven't properly left feudalism. I mean, I don't mean to say that that's not what you're implying, kind of thing, but like,
I think, yeah. I think for me, though, I kind of view that and monopolies as well as an aberration in class behavior. And I get, what I will say, though, is I do understand what he's saying about, yes, every capitalist would want a monopoly and would want a rent to sit on. 100% that's true. But I think that other than like maybe some circumstances, how stable are monopolies without political protection? And he gets into that. He's basically like, rents don't exist without political protections. But it's like, it's hard to say that this is a trend when it's like, yeah, I think that a Marxist economic position on monopolies is that they are not sustainable over the long term, and that they can't be, because there's always going to be competition and there's going to be somebody that undercuts you somewhere, right? Unless you have that political protection, in which case he is saying rent is entirely political. And the kind of funny thing about rents is that they have this cyclical behavior where like somebody will wind up losing their rent, then somebody else will get it, because people are constantly in competition with them trying to undercut the source of their rent or whatever so that they can then get it. And then it just kind of flips back and forth. So I don't know. I'm interested in like, is this a tendency of the class? Is this an aberration? I think it's like a longue durée thing. I guess.
I mean, maybe it's incorrect to say that it's a tendency of a class psychology, I guess, if that is that is kind of what he's saying, right there. Where he's saying it is as a result of a comprehensible class interest, that there is this process that he's calling aristocratization or whatever. But maybe the way I've come to think about the development toward increased rentier an increase in the sort of like rentier nature of the economy and the monopolization of the economy, which I think is a trend that he's identified, which has been borne out, right? Like particularly in the space of like the big like tech giant monopolies now. But that does sort of like those tech monopolies do intersect the real economy, right? Like just because Amazon is a tech company, what they do is distribution, right? And they've monopolized distribution, or so many other things. The way I've come to think about it is that happens as a result of the declining rate of profit, right? Like the only way to be a profitable company now is to monopolize, as he says in this, like a commodity stream, like the entirety of a commodity stream. Because if I almost said normal, like in some ways what he's trying to make us get away from is almost thinking that there is a normal form of capitalism, there is a normal form of bourgeois behavior, I suppose, and he's saying that it's a much more historical phenomena. The behavior of the bourgeoisie, the nature of capitalism, is a historical phenomena. He doesn't really talk about the declining rate of profit, but if there is a process whereby profits are declining over time, and one of the ways that they've learned that capitalism has learned to escape that secular trend, is to find ways to create and then protect through, as you say, like state behavior, find ways to protect those monopolies. Then maybe it is a process that's happening, and it is a historical development of the necessity for capitalism to survive. It has to move into that kind of mode. So I think he's identifying something that in subsequent years after this was written has kind of been borne out, or that's the analysis that I think I've been exposed to. That I don't know.
No, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. I think that this could probably definitely do with a modern update, as well as applying the idea of the falling rate of profit to it, and just the general nature of capitalist economy. Because kind of what he's trying to do here is say that, hey, he comes out at the end and he's like, even though I've said all of this, the bourgeoisie is still the main protagonist of capitalism. Duh. It's in the name, folks, capitalism. But he also says that they're political actors just as much as economic actors, right? So, and because you need political protections for rents, I think you're right. Well, I really appreciated when he was just like, listen, capitalism is nothing, can be defined as nothing else other than accumulation at all costs and just a continuing cycle of accumulation. I appreciated that, because he was like, all these other things, maybe they're just ancillary, but still important to understand. And I think that if we if we use historical hindsight to project the industrialist of, I don't know, Bolton in the 19th century onto like 16th century origins of capitalism, or if we kind of like project, the behavior of burghers onto like, billionaires now, yeah, you're going to run into some inconsistencies. If you wanted to be vulgar about it, I guess it's like a base and superstructure thing about trying to weed your way through the superstructure to really understand the base, because, content and form's always going to change. It's going to constantly change. And that always trips up Marxists, because they're like, wait a minute, it was supposed to look like this thing 100 years ago, right? That's, one of the reasons that Marxists are still clinging on to political strategies from 100 years ago. But, what are you going to do? The last section. Should we talk about the last section really quick? Because this is where it tripped me up.
Yeah.
I don't get it.
Yeah. I mean,
this just seemed like it's titled Human Capital, and all I'll say is it just seems like he, out of the blue, is just like, oh yeah, so opportunity hoarding. There you go. That's a thing, huh?
Yeah. And I didn't like the political implications of what he was saying, really. And anyway, he just in the sort of section before that, he sort of starts to imply that, going back to what we were saying at the beginning, where he does kind of recognize the essential class nature of the capitalist mode of production, right? What he is saying, okay, there is an economic surplus that's being created by the working class, and the returns from that economic surplus don't necessarily go to the working class. They're shaved off by a bourgeois class, I suppose, by the bourgeoisie. He's saying that doesn't really take the classical form of a factory owner and a sort of like Victorian urchin kind of thing. But but rather what the sort of like the class society that he's describing toward the end of this piece seems to compose primarily proletarian wage earners who are being exploited, and a kind of bourgeois wage earner who is benefiting and reaping the surplus. So there is still that sort of class division, but that sort of like that bourgeois class, that representative of the new bourgeois class, is both a wage earner and also somebody who's directly controlling capital without kind of owning it. And he seems to be implying that there's a sort of been this destruction of a sort of classical representative of the bourgeoisie who owns capital, which seems quite an extreme conclusion to have ended up with. I don't know whether that was your reading, whether that seems to be what he's implying, or
I think my reading was him talking about the way in which the bourgeois-ified proles reproduce bourgeois-ified proles, if that makes sense. Because he brings up education, and he's like, this is the main struggle of the main site of the class struggle. And it's like, whoa, what? Where were you giving this speech? At a university, I would imagine. Yeah. because he basically says that because the new middle class can't like give a kind of past, like a rent to its next generation, much like an aristocratized bourgeoisie can. I mean, right?
I feel like he really didn't foresee the grotesque levels of the grotesque increase in the rentier population of countries like the UK. Like, what I'm speaking to here is there is a generation who owns lots of property and rents it, like who are members of the bourgeois class who have sort of like hoovered up all of the housing stock and then rent it back to people, kind of thing, which is a more recent process. Which that's what I was thinking about all the way through this, where he was saying that like the new bourgeoisie isn't capable of accumulating property that it can rent out.
Yeah. Well, then you just have to wait
in
for
some ways, in the language that he's presenting, that is what's happened. But I don't know.
Yeah. But the educational stuff is that because that the kind of what he calls the new middle class, but it is the kind of bourgeois-ified, even though they're not actually bourgeois, but the bourgeois-ified culturally middle class, like because they can't give a rent to their kids or something like that most of the time, even though they kind of sit in this weird kind of quasi-rent area because they have this like control over certain parts of the economy. They can't bequeath that because we live in a meritocracy. Thanks a lot. The conservative philosophers saw it coming. The bourgeois state can't work with the bourgeois society. Because they can't do that, they have to kind of like save a special space in privileged education centers for their kids. Because he's basically like, you know, we made fun of Althusser for saying this in the past, but he's like, what is a school if not a place to make you sit quietly for 8 hours and to train you to control other proles? And everyone goes, wow, that's so deep. But it is true to a certain extent. It's like, who comes out of universities if they aren't like me and they did a useful degree? What do they come out of universities doing, right? They come out of universities as data scientists to come up with ways to improve guard labor, or they come out as like business sickos. I don't know what business people go on to do, presumably business of some kind. They always seem to do well for themselves. So they always are able to like, this is the way that the new middle class bequeaths, you know, I don't know, a good life, or at least they reserve a certain segment of their class for their kids, is by like reserving this space in privileged education centers, which is obviously true, right? It's like, how many fail sons have gotten accepted into Stanford, you know what I mean, or into Yale? Yale is literally just fail sons, as far as I can tell. So, you know, it's interesting. It is interesting. And I mean, again, this is very like concrete analysis. If you want to do political work, this is very necessary. But yeah, it's kind of funny. I do think it's hilarious when he brings up in the middle of this, the conservative thinkers who are like, in England, you know, during the 19th century, there was a guy who was like, thank God England still has a queen, because otherwise the bourgeoisie would get way out of control and the whole country would fall apart. Because if things ever got like truly secularized, it would all fall apart. Whereas, you know, there's this other conservative guy in Austria who was like, the bourgeoisie have taken control, the world is ending, even though they like respect quote unquote free market ideas. He kind of winds up being like, they kind of had a point. Like, bourgeois meritocracy kind of shoots itself in the foot, you know what I mean? Or at least encourages this kind of like rentier behavior. But yeah, what are you going to do?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it's, as you say, like an opportunity hoarding description of the class divide, I guess. He also seems to have quite a like almost like a positive. Well, if you have a left wing politics, he seems to have quite a positive and rosy outlook on what this human capital, this definition of the class relation, which is defined by having or not having human capital, by which he means having or not having a good education and a way into being a member of the professional managerial class, I suppose. And he sort of implies that this appears to everybody as being incredibly arbitrary. We are ruled by the smart people because they were able to get the education, kind of thing. And he seems to be implying that there are sort of like political dividends to be reaped by a left in the political context of living in a country where that's so self-evidently the case to the lower classes, kind of thing, to the working class. I don't know how you felt about that sort of thesis. I was a bit unsure. I think I feel more comfortable with the argument you were making before of the political worthwhileness of telling people that talking about like not being a wage earner and having nothing else but your wage, kind of thing, and that nature of the class divide being one which is politically advantageous. And almost this one here, he seems to be advocating a kind of bourgeois ideology, which I think actually works quite well on people, which is this: there isn't a fundamental class divide. It's actually just a sort of meritocratic spectrum, and you fall on a different level on it. And these people have clearly worked very hard to get the education that they have, so they deserve to be paid a little bit more. Yeah, I don't know whether you have any thoughts.
Yeah,
I'm not sure it's as useful as he thinks it is.
I think it's. I mean, he doesn't come out and say it's useful. He comes out and says it is happening. The working class is realizing how silly this is. Mm-hmm. And on one hand, I agree with him, because what is more believable, that everybody who's in charge is smarter than you, even though you can just go on Twitter and be like, well, that's clearly not the case.
Mhm.
Or that people are in charge because God put them in charge, Dan, and don't question God. I've said this before, like in English towns, if you just lived in like a mud thatched hut in like the 1200s and then you came into town and you saw a fucking cathedral, you'd be like, yeah, God's real. Okay, God's real.
Mhm.
Oh, okay, that person is in charge because God put them in charge. Yeah, okay, that's fair. That's, I understand that. I understand that, and I think that people are really beginning to realize that, wait a minute, we've been told that this is a meritocracy. It's clearly not. People are clearly just sitting on rents, and if you're born with rich parents, it's pretty easy to like have it made, right? But on the other hand, that is just ideology. You know what I mean? And he's kind of putting the cart before the horse a little bit. And again, I think this is where you're right, like more of an analysis of the economic underpinnings of why these things are taking place would really behoove this piece. Because I think that, like, yeah, ideology at the end of the day is kind of an outgrowth of existing trends in the like material reality of like political economy. You know what I mean? And while I do think that ideology is always obviously going to be politically useful because politics and ideology, they go hand in hand. Yeah, it's why is this happening is I guess the question that I would ask. I would say that the wheels aren't coming off the bus because people woke up one day and are like, oh, right, Elon Musk is a fucking idiot. Jeff Bezos is a sicko. You know what I mean? Like the wheels are coming off the bus because accumulation is slowing down and the working class is getting less and less. So, what are you gonna do?
This discussion of the like the realization that people are going to make of the unfairness of the system and a sort of general skepticism to this class of person that rules over us. All it really made me think of was like the suspicion of experts but also it made me think of just like the general language around people who voted for Brexit or Trump
Yeah.
or this kind of thing, which now, as we're talking, makes me think, well, okay, if this is a process that's happening, there still needs to be a political process that captures that mood or doesn't. And so far, the left hasn't really captured the mood of, hey, this is really unfair and unjust, and this class system needs to be overthrown.
It'll be interesting to see where the cleavages come about, especially in terms of the working class, because it's like the proles and the bourgeois-ified proles. When's that going to split? You know what I mean? Because you never see your actual boss. You never depends on where people work, unless you work in like a mom and pop shop. But it's like, I don't know. The last time I worked at like a place where I actually knew my boss was when I worked at like a pub. Well, and even then, like it wasn't even a freehold. So like technically I didn't even know my boss. You know what I mean? So it's like, the people that you see and that you fucking hate, like those oftentimes are the bourgeois-ified proles. So it's like, oh, it's going to be kind of tricky getting those people, those proles on board when there's this much of attention. So, which again is why like this stuff is important. You can't just kind of fall back and be lazy on the like, stereotypical view of Marxism, which is that there are two classes done. You fall into one of those camps because if you're actually trying to organize or do something with your life, then it's not as simple. You know what I mean? Bit of personal experience here. We had a big all kind of local branch meeting of my union today that we've been organizing for a while. And it was to kind of like, okay, how are we as a branch going to respond to these, kind of like the kind of like bullshit pay offers we've been getting and a bunch of stuff. And it was basically a way of kind of seeing if people would be interested in industrial action, right? And usually I get quite frustrated with union stuff. And I'm kind of just like, fuck me. It's just like, all of the organizing, you just realize that all of this work is to just translate, I'm going to sound like a bit of an asshole, but it's like to translate the spontaneous frustrations and revolutionary anger of people, which is always there, into like a language that management understands. And that's kind of just like all you're doing. And it gets really frustrating. But I left today feeling really good and just feeling really happy. And I was trying to figure out why. And I think it was because it was just a big complaint fest and people were just getting really angry and just like, and then this asshole, this guy, and then you believe what this person said. And everybody was talking about this strata of people, this like, the new middle class or the bourgeois-ified proles. And I think I realized maybe the reason I do this stuff is just because I like sticking it to people. It's just cool to stick it to the man sometimes. I just felt really good. I was like, one of these days, they're just going to get it stuck to them. And it's just nice. Like, I know that it's weighted in the favor of the bourgeoisie and, they're always going to, really get their way no matter what we do, even if we go on strike. But maybe we can make it just a little bit more difficult for them. And I was left and I was like, that makes me feel good. Stick it to the new middle class. That's what I'm telling people.
Good. Well, that's a nice note to approach the end on.
Yeah, cross-class alliances, who needs them? I'm trying to split up actual classes, Dan. So Wallerstein, interesting stuff. Yeah. I don't know, what are your final kind of takeaways from? Was this useful?
Yeah, I'm definitely going to keep going back to some of these ideas and trying to work out how I feel about them. It's definitely good to it's good for I've appreciated having some of my thinking about class challenged a little bit, and obviously I really appreciate the effort to develop historically some of these concepts about class while still keeping in place some of the sort of like core tenets of thinking around the exploitative nature of class relations. So I do appreciate it, and I would like to. Yeah, I think we've agreed that we're going to try and read some more, try and engage in some world systems theory thinking, and challenge our deep-seated Brennerism a little bit.
You begin with Jason W. Moore, and then you read Wallerstein. Is what you do.
Yes. Shit.
Okay, you got stuff you got to do, Dan. I'm tired. I'm going to make dinner. I have enjoyed podcasting with you once again. It's been nice to get back into it. Back at it. I was frothing at the mouth there for a little while. I was like, I haven't podcasted in 4 weeks. But yes, it's been very nice. I've enjoyed talking with you, Dan, and I'm looking forward to whatever we do next.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. Sorry for the big gap, everybody listening, and thanks for sticking out to the end of this one. It's very nice to be back with you. And likewise, Jack, it's nice to be podcasting with you again. Yeah. So
see you later.
We'll see everybody next time.
The music you heard this episode was Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. If you like this song, you can check it out and much, much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. Be sure and follow us up on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And if you like what you heard, be sure and tune in next week for some more commie discussion. Till next time.